So, hello. Can you hear me? I hope so. So, I would like to start with this webinar now, and I hope you are all well connected. As I can see, I see here the main participants, which are also those ones which will present their presentations. And therefore, I would like to welcome you firstly and to this webinar with the title Climate Policy for All, Equity and Growth in the Light of the Climate Crisis. And as you can see, this is a joint project that we are here putting forward. It's a program that we are collaborating with Cities Alliance on their program, which is Fostering Equitable Economic Growth in Cities, which is chaired by the UK Department for International Development. And when I'm talking about we, then it's us, researchers from different parts of the world, which are together here working with Cities Alliance on the understanding mainly on how we can interlink policy making with research. And on one hand, this is the European Network of Researchers of N-AERUS, where I also belong to, being affiliated to the Technical University in Berlin. And it's also the AURI network that we hope also that we will have them on board when we will start the questions and answer sessions. And this is also the Redeus LAC network, which is this Latin American and Caribbean network of urban researchers, which were also so friendly to help us to find also the people to talk with and also to understand better what is going on in the region. And in particular, because this is the region that we will today talk about when we will question us, what kind of climate policies do we need? And in particular, what has this also to do with equity and growth when we are talking about climate crisis? And this is the framework that we will start to talk about. And I would like also then further on to explain you a little bit the structure. But for us, which is very interesting to explain, is to use the learning goals, because this topic is very, I would say it's very prominent actually, and we've been to different conferences. I mean, the COP25, one of the biggest one, but also people who have not made it to the COP25 in Madrid had also the possibility to enter into discussions which are related always with the climate crisis, and there's always coming this understanding of the relation between equity and growth in the climate crisis. And therefore, I would like to frame the webinar so that we understand all where we would like to start to discuss this topic. On one hand, we understand that there is this kind of climate change and equity relationship when it comes, for example, to effective climate policy, which requires a rapid increase in monetary aspect, in political and in civil investment and coordination at all levels of decision making. But at the same time, and there's also very important when we are thinking about climate change, we have to address the uneven impact of crisis in the most, let's say in the most cases, it's targeting the vulnerable populations and the corresponding social challenges. So it means that there you can see that in particular, when we had the chance to enter into this discussion in Latin America, what we understood there is, on one hand, we have this strong understanding of growth, which is related with these aspects of extractivism, of primary industries putting forward this kind of extractivistic, let's say, industries, and also the related urban and also economic structures with that. But on the other hand, if we have a look on what does climate crisis also means for the region in itself, then we will rapidly understand that, for example, heating points and environment sacrifice zones are there related where we find the most vulnerable parts of the society. So this is what we would like to enter into this discussion to understand how these three terms are related: climate change, equity, and growth. And on the other hand, what would be then for us important if we start to understand the learning goals of this webinar is also to learn about the actions which are actually going on, which are financial, technological, logistical one, for taking care or for trying to to enhance equity-based approaches in programs, in policies, and in research interfaces. And finally, we would like to learn from that kind of activities and of actions, which we will hear when we will hear our speakers. We would like to understand about the governance. So what kind of governance do we need to frame when it comes to a climate policy, a national, a regional, and a local one, as to understand how different inequalities can be connected, as well as problems can be reduced. This is very ambitious. We have to agree, because this is actually the state of art, which is discussed actually in different parts of the world. But for us, it's very interesting, because we are trying here in this cooperation also between the three networks to understand what are the possibilities in terms of when we connect the research and the policy making together. So there is this very thin line, which we are always trying to find what kind of, for example, also learning agreements we have to do, which kind of people do we have to incorporate into this kind of cooperations. So I would like to introduce the structure of the webinar now. So you see, I already made the introduction. Then I would like to understand with our participants and with the speakers together, I would like to understand what kind of promotions or actions are putting forward to promote social equity in the climate crisis. And then we would start to the question and answer, which is the third point of this webinar. And then we will understand also that this is also a series of webinar where we will also understand basically how this is then related with the next topics that we are putting forward also with Cities Alliance. But firstly, I would like to explain you a little bit also what we have perceived in the last months during that the COP was also changed to Madrid. And Anthony and me, we both as here as the ones who are moderating, we came both across to make presentations in one of the COP25 in Madrid itself, where we were invited to have a side event with different, let's say, also researchers on, in particular, this understanding of the, let's say, the interface between research and policymaking. And maybe, Anthony, you want to start with that, and then I also second you and let you know what I, being in Chile at that time doing research, I could then also explain what I saw about these three terms which are going on actually in the discussions locally in Santiago. So I would like to give the word then to Anthony.
Yes, thank you very much, Paola. My name is Anthony Bonanda-Fuchs. I'm working with the University of St. Gallen in Latin America, and then I had the pleasure to go to the COP25 because I was replacing Paola as she was already in Chile. And it was for me the first COP that I attended, so I will share with you my relatively personal and also limited view because I was there only for a couple of days. But I think it symbolizes a lot where we are at the moment, because I have to say I'm not surprised that there was not like a far-reaching compromise reached, because you could almost pick up such feeling at the COP. On the one hand, it's truly amazing how you see how urgency can be used to really quickly realize something. So Madrid really managed to create and to organize a large international event in very, very short time. But for someone who has hoped that this would like kind of incentivize like different discussion, etc., you just needed to be there. That it really felt a lot like business as usual. So the researchers were like presenting their research, and the politicians then well, they did politics. So I this is really something relatively pessimistic, and it created a little bit like a colorate, like additional information to those students' protests, and also the frustration that the younger generation has. On a positive note, I have been to a panel that presented relatively engaging research that really aimed at sharing experiences in Latin America, how you bring different sectors together, and this is definitely something that this work that we are presenting here is also contributing, and I think also where Latin America has to show a lot, as traditionally academia has always been very close to other sectors in trying to develop cross-sectoral collaboration. So yeah, the COPE, it was definitely nice to see, but neither in terms of formats nor what was presented, it was something very surprising. You got kind of the feeling, a lot of discussion about loss and damage, so rather on short-term goals instead of seeing the large pictures. And it felt like you were discussing like how many buckets you get and the size of the buckets, instead of really discussing how to fix the hole in your boat. That was a little bit my impression.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe I explain you what I have seen in Chile. I mean, since Anthony was already saying that I'm actually doing research on co-production and on urban co-production, and obviously the initiatives which are taking forward for climate crisis and the different groups that are related in, let's say, in regional but also in local level is very impressive, I have to say, actually, what I'm seeing in Chile, but what I have also seen here in Ecuador, where I'm also working with the GZ together on the aspect of the new urban agenda. But what I was very, let's say, very amazed and very kind of enthusiastic was I attended the Cumbres de los Pueblos in Santiago de Chile while the COP was in Madrid. And it was very interesting because what happened there was that, let's say, different local groups from Latin America, from Argentina, from Ecuador, and also from Quito and from Colombia, and also from Chile came together to discuss, in particular, this understanding of how is originally this idea of growth related with the aspect of extractivism. And there was a big kind of questioning about this in terms to understand, is this really this kind of growth that we can afford any longer in the region, or is it not something which I came across to hear the first time also in Ecuador, this understanding of el derecho a la naturaleza, which was this understanding as to see let's say the environment also as an agent additionally to that wants to have to needs to be also incorporated, and with them also the different people and the different groups, or let's say also the different indigenous groups which are related also to this let's say environment which needs to be connected. And therefore there was this vivid discussion on how you do this governance, how you can interlink, for example, this extractivism, which are monoclusterings, which are monoculture, and where you can understand how do you can put in this kind of developments, also in this kind of urban development, you have to understand that you ensure, for example, the necessities in an equitable way, for example, for the society, for the people working there. And this was very interesting that you heard a lot about this kind of environment sacrificed zones, where at least, I mean, of course, the environment is sacrificed, but there's a lot of equity going on actually. And this was this kind of where this pairs came together with this big question on what kind of growth do we really need in the region, and how this growth can be equitable. And I think that's a very interesting starting point also for what we would like to discuss here. And I would like to open the discussion now also to our speakers. And firstly, I would like you to please yourself present, because I see also already from the different people which are here connected that not only one speaker is there, there are also two speakers sometimes there. So therefore, I would like to ask you and to encourage you also please to present yourself properly. But I would like to explain to you the first of all, the as you can see also here on the slide, you can see the round of presenters. So we will start with the presentation from René Hohmann, head of the Global Programs of Cities Alliance, and then we will go on further to Nicola Bodegard, the director from the EBP in Chile, and then we will go to Marina Gosselin from the ECLAC, which is part of the CEPAL, the Cities Program at the Economical Center for Latin America. So I would like to give the word now to René, so that please present yourself and start with your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Paula. Thank you, Tony, for that kind introduction. I also prepared some slides that I think Colin will put on. First of all, I'm very happy for your remarks referring to the outcomes of the COP conference. I think what we can already discuss today is that while we see potentially some shortcomings at the multilateral level, that gives us a clear view where action needs to be found, and that action is at the local level, and to explore and better understand that. This is one of the purposes why we are very happy to contribute to this webinar today on climate policy for all and equity and growth in the light of the climate crisis. I'm happy to provide some very quick remarks why we think the subject is not only of relevance, but even, I think, more central to us. Can I have the first slide, please? Thank you. So the Cities Alliance, as Paula already referred to, is a global partnership strengthening the role of cities in poverty reduction and sustainable development. That has been, I think, identified as a mission of the Cities Alliance for quite some time. I mean, I would see that our mission will, at some point, only say strengthen the role of cities, because poverty reduction and sustainable development needs to be, I think, also in the future, be conceptualized as one thing. And this is what I would like to talk about. As a fund and a membership organization, we focus on advancing new tools, practices, and policy dialogues at the global level. But as you can see also in the picture here, which depicts a situation in Liberia and Monrovia, we facilitate direct technical assistance in a few priority countries. In those, we are working at the national level to support the formulation of national policies, at the city level to strengthen citywide planning capacities, and at the community level to create and fund basic services and community-based infrastructure, especially in informal settlements. Now, what has this to do with equity and growth and climate crisis? We would argue, and can you please stay there? I will tell. Thank you. That the current urban transition, and please allow me to focus a bit more on Africa, because this is I think a region where we work primarily. The urban transition, especially in Africa, is shaping the conditions in which future generations will work, live, and consume and interact for decades to come. So I would argue that the biggest failure of climate policies, and this is the definition, it's not the climate policies in Africa, is not to use the short window of opportunity that to shape urbanization, especially to create the public services and governance mechanisms for the urban poor. So why am I saying this? Why do I want to conflude all those equity issues into climate? I mean, if you will see a little bit about the figures, so within the next 20 years, 60% of the population will live in cities in Africa. The youth will be the largest labor force with 1.1 billion, and over 60% that are already living in formal settlement will grow. And we think that some indications indicate that 93% of the new jobs will be in the informal sector. So what we've already know from research is that climate change amplifies vulnerability and hampers the adaptive capacity, especially of the urban poor. But what is needed is to first change the global understanding of those vulnerabilities to inform urban policies, and then, of course, to also fund and also promote those policies for equity and environmental justice. And now I come to the global level. Next slide, please. One of example of how this shift in understanding can be supported is we see here. This figure is taken from the second assessment report of the Urban Climate Change Research Network under Cynthia Rosenzweig's work, shows an indicator measuring the vulnerability of a city against 3 indicators taken from the City Prosperity Index from UN Habitat. Here, the researchers just picked 3 out of 6 dimensions and focused on the extent of equity and social inclusion, environmental sustainability, and quality of life. Across the cases, I mean, I'm very sorry if you can't see actually the figures here, and that's the downside of presentations. But there is a fantastic report. Across the cases, we see that equity is generally low in Central and Southern Africa and in cities of South America. So what these kind of analysis are getting at is that low equity goes along with a low quality of life, identified through health, education, safety, which will likely be accentuated by climate change impacts. So and this is, I think, the understanding that if we talk about climate policies, we talk essentially about the question of access to services. We question about the vulnerability of those populations that live in informality, and this is differs across the world. But we are targeting actually the question of access to voice, access to services, and this is one of the key, I think, venues that we would like to explore when we talk about the capacity to respond to climate and economic shocks in the future. Next slide, please. I was also asked, so now I'm jumping between adaptation policies and mitigation policies, and I think this is in the future, these terms shouldn't exist anymore. What I would like to now just give you another link to a publication that we recently explored is the link between how local governments can effectively manage ecosystem services to foster an equitable economic growth, both for the formal and informal sector. Here, if we talk about ecosystem services, we talk about clean air, we talk about water provision, we talk about energy provision, agriculture, but also the land management and access to public spaces. In this rather theoretical approach, we're trying to link these kind of ecosystem service managements with economic outcomes and highlight what the role of local governments could be. The next slide, please. And this is the brochure, for example, revisits, based on case studies, a number of policy instruments and tools that helps local governments, despite their constraints, how to regulate the use of ecosystem goods to protect ecosystem services, be it regulatory standards, be it public investments, property rights, and behavioral changes. I mean, we've used a number of case studies, such as in India, in Peru, and Congo and China, to really dig through a story, and in a case to retrace what local governments did to, for example, increase increase the atmosphere, so improve the integrated transport system, revisiting the water supply and sewerage, revisiting also the way of production. Of course, at small scale, we're not talking about extractive industries here. We talk about how I think food systems can be maintained while using, I think, an equitable access to resources by the whole population. I was given 8 minutes, and since we've already heard so much in the introduction, I don't want to dwell long on these case studies, but you can review it. Next slide, please, on the website. So what I think what is missing from our side, and that's why this is the learning outcome of webinars such as these, is to identify the questions that we would like to address further in the future. So what is missing in a nutshell is, as I've referred to, that if we talk about urban policies in the future, they should not differentiate between certain sectors, or whether they should be equitable, or they should address climate change. We need to understand that in most of the cities in which we work, we have already, the climate crisis has already begun. I showed you the picture from Monrovia. The climate crisis has begun in Monrovia 5-10 years ago, and we see also I think the diminishing capacity of responding to future crises, and this is what not a city or a government can, I think, withstand during the next, I think, urbanization, the years to come. So I think what we need to revisit is also on the understanding how we inform those policies that are affecting, in particular, the informal sector and people living in informality. How the big infrastructure projects that we all hear about in Africa, for example, how they apply social environmental safeguards if it's not done in a typical developmental partnership. So meaning, what are the new kinds of actors that fund big investment projects, and how can this be shaped by the local communities, but also by local national governments in a manner that we need to meet climate targets, but also equity issues on the ground. So in a nutshell, I mean, I'm referring here also to documents that we've produced recently. One is with World Resource Institute, how to prepare communities against climate change. And this is something that we would like to address, especially in the year 2020, where we'll contribute to the Global Year of Action on Adaptation. And with that, focus on informality and how these climate how informal settlements and economies are affected by climate change impacts will guide us in the next year. So this is my input to the discussion. I'm looking forward to have to also hear some experiences, of course, from other regions, but this is more or less an introduction to a continued discussion with the networks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, René, for this interesting presentation. So, I mean, I was trying already, or the whole time, also to make the linkage to Latin America, and I have here 3 remarks which I found very interesting. One is that I would say that this is a global phenomena, that of course climate change policies needs to be related in a local way and also with different actors. But I came also across to something that you were saying, which I find very interesting, and also when it comes to this kind of discussion which is going on actually in Latin America about this kind of mono production, and which is called extractivism, let's say, where you are saying that there's the need, or what you are working on is this idea of an environment, let's say, of an entire ecosystem service. This is what you were exactly saying, where it's obviously an issue which is interrelated with different topics, like, for example, infrastructures, energy, and also the ecosystem in itself, right? So understand the ecosystem in a bigger picture than only, let's say, the rural and the urban zones, which I think it's also something which is also very much active, actually, the discussion in Latin America to understand how you can interlink this understanding of the rural and the urban, because they are, in a productive way, they are interrelated, but the understanding would be how to fit it in that way, or to make it in this way understandable, that it's an entire ecosystem which requires also an integrative response, which interrelates on one hand to, let's say, different parts of the society, but also is interrelated with different topics. And I think this is a discussion where I would like also to hand over to Nicola, because as I understand, they are working in Latin America a lot in, let's say, also what the third point that I have was also that I don't forget this one. It's this kind of exchange, the exchange on different regions, which I also understand this is very important to understand what is going on in different parts and how we can learn from each other. Because if you look, for example, also to Latin America, also we learned this now from you too, there are problems which are quite similar, and we could understand how solutions or how actions are being put forward. And I would like to pass the conversation to Nicola, so that please, Nicola, can you present yourself firstly, and then start with your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, do you hear? No, camera.
Yes, we hear you pretty well.
Yes, the camera, it seems we can't put on the camera. Hello everybody, I'm Nicola Beauregard. I'm in charge of AWP Chile. It's a consultancy company dedicated to energy, climate change, and natural resources. I have an extensive background in public policy making, in energy and sustainability, basically. And I'm here with Mauricio Villaseñor. He's directly in charge of local energy projects here at EDP. So we are going to speak a little bit about one specific program that we are implementing here in Chile that really combines very well the question of social equity that you spoke about, Paula, social equity, social injustice, the social crisis, really together with climate change and the energy sector. And I'm going to try to relate this very specific, concrete program to public policy making at the end of this very brief presentation. So if you change the slides, thanks a lot. As everybody knows, the social crisis has also arrived to Chile. This was probably a very long way to really get to explode and get expressed in this social upheaval in the last 6 weeks. And what is expressed in the social crisis is really the question of social injustice, inequality, and abuse that has occurred for many years and decades in Chile. So this is only probably the final expression of what has been occurring over the last decades. So when we look at that, probably at first sight, we relate that to pensions, to the health system, to the education system, and there's probably at first sight an absence of the environmental issues and the climate change issues. But then if you look a little bit deeper and more carefully into this, and Paula has mentioned that in the introduction, you clearly relate the social injustice and inequality also to environmental issues. Speaking about, for example, the zones of sacrifice, environmental sacrifice, that has become very normal to deal with here in Chile and to accept it, that there are certain zones of environmental sacrifice in which the people really have to accept high contamination levels and abuse, in that sense, environmental abuse in their areas. And it's related also to the fact that when we look at climate change, that we have the most vulnerable parts of society really suffering the most in the climate crisis. And we just had a couple of weeks ago, and currently ongoing also, the crisis in our agricultural sector, where we have very small farmers, goat farmers, for example, very close to the city, to the metropolitan area of Santiago, that are suffering with thousands and tens of thousands of their cattle and goats that are dying. And so consequently also these small-scale farmers are really heavily impacted by the climate change crisis. So it's a social crisis that is very much related to the environmental crisis. If you can change that. So at the same time, we are experiencing the energy transition. And it's very interesting to look at that. It's not only energy transition is not only about renewable energies. It's not only about the arrival of solar energy or wind energy or other types of energy, specifically solar in the case of Chile. It's not only about efficient lighting. Those are like the topics that are really very much in the news, but it's also very much about the use of energy in buildings. It's about the use of energy in transport. So we have below we have the Tesla car and the electromobility. We have batteries arriving to the system, to the energy system, so we can manage well the variable energy sources like solar or wind. We have efficient buildings, and you see here the last building by the Rocky Mountain Institute in the United States. That is one of the most efficient buildings in the United States, and it succeeds to obtain about an 83 to 85% of energy savings with regard to the conventional type of building. We also have the smart meters that you see below that are being rolled out not only in the industrialized countries, but also here in Chile and also in other Latin American countries. And we have to see, so if you change the slide, we have to see how we really make sure how this energy transition would be accessible for all. Renee spoke about basic services, and this is about basic services, but it is also about being included in what is going on with regard to the basic changes all around the world. And energy is certainly one of these basic issues. So we have to make this accessible for all. We have to include everybody, and we have to make sure that we deal with the relevant problems for the citizens. So if we speak about Chile, it's very different from Africa, and it's very different from Ecuador or Colombia, where we also work, but in a very different way. So we have to make sure that this is being dealt with, and we have to take a local approach, understanding the territory and the people's needs. If you click 3 times on the... So local problems, for example, in Chile, are definitely transport problems, contamination, high contamination levels due to heating with firewood and biomass. And so we have to confront these issues. So now we get into the Energy City program. We started the Energy City program a couple of years ago in the Ministry of Energy when I worked there. And the Energy City program is a great platform to really deal with concrete problems at the local level and introduce more governance for energy at the local level. Renee pointed out that local governance is really the big and important issue to confront the problems we have. So the Energy Cities program is a platform for confronting these specific issues. Let's look at some of these specific issues that are being confronted in the Energy Cities programs. For example, issues such as the goat farmers that I mentioned before. So they go into the hills for a large part of the year and they have no access to energy. So we have to really invent new solutions, energy solutions, to make energy accessible for these people and these groups and these productive sectors. Also, in the framework of this platform of Energy Cities, we started to aggregate demand. So for solar PV systems. So these are new instruments, these are new methods for dealing with the introduction of renewable energy. New financial models have been introduced so that we can really succeed in reducing also the price of these systems and make them available for the large part of the community, not only for specific and individual projects, but aggregation of demand was a new way of making these types of systems accessible for everybody. That's also another example that was introduced through the Energy Cities program. And then we arrived also to types, not only projects, but programs. So this energy inclusion program was also started through the Energy Cities program. And the objective is to really make clean energy accessible to vulnerable households, at the same time as strengthening local development. So we make energy accessible to the local households, but we are thinking also about how to make this accessible and how to make this sustainable in the long term. So for example, not only we deal with energy efficiency solutions for the household, but we also believe that we have to deal with setting up energy providers, energy services at the local level so that they can really directly deal with these energy problems at the local level. So let's look at some of the data. We started in one community in Santiago. The specific community is a poorer community. As you know, Santiago is very segregated socially, and this is one of the socially lower income communities. And in this case, we have an average income of $580 in that community. Let's see how we deal with the program at this level. We have 5 elements through which we intervene. First, we do a diagnosis of what's going on in the community, of what the problems are, what they're facing, what types of problems they're facing. We select the households that can participate in this program. We do a very careful selection of this. Then we identify the opportunities to intervene. And these opportunities are really very much related then to the problems and the necessities of the specific households. And we look at that in a second. We design financial models and we intervene then monitoring what we can do. And we implement the solutions also through small scale and micro enterprises at the local level, not only through other companies that come in from the outside. So we regard this as a type of living lab. Now we see a couple of images from these interventions. You see that main challenges are concentrated in electrical installations. We were not very much aware of that at the beginning of the program, but you see how really precarious the situation is at the local level with I think the images speak for themselves. Here we see insulation of the households, of the houses. They're very badly insulated. These are extreme cases in the images. But the problem behind this is really self-construction. So we have to deal with social housing that is expanded afterwards, after it's been handed over to the people, and it's a big problem for the isolation. So that's confronted also. The cold in winter, 93% of the families surveyed declared to feel really cold in winter, and that is also the case certainly for water access. We have more than 10% of the families that do not have warm water to have a bath or for cooking or anything. Energy, the cost of energy with regard to monthly income is also an important issue that has to be dealt with, and that leads to electricity theft and default, and that's certainly a large problem also for the energy companies at the end. Let's go to the last one. So all these images are just showing a little bit more of the situation. I want to round it up with probably a couple of comments on the policy implications of this specific case. So I would like to speak very briefly about 3 interventions that we should be looking at when we see social inequity combined with the question of environmental inequity and injustice and climate change, in this case of energy. So we feel that, first of all, certainly the intervention has to be general social, economic, fiscal policies. Second of all, energy policies specifically for this area. Vulnerable communities have to be presented and included in the NDCs, in the nationally determined contributions, in the climate change strategies. They have to be present in the long-term climate change strategy, and they have to be certainly present in the energy policies. So we have to introduce policies of energy efficiency, policies of solar energy introduction that are directed directly at these vulnerable groups. And we have to strengthen these types of programs such as energy city programs. Third, specific interventions, and these specific interventions are, like an example, this energy inclusion program, and those are public-private initiatives. So we insist very much also on the parallel intervention with public-private initiatives. I think we conclude with that as the as a brief introduction to what we're doing on the ground with all these partners that we mention on this last slide, one of these last slides. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this impressive presentation. I think what came into my mind when I was looking to your presentation is something which is also very much related with what we also tried to frame in the beginning this webinar about, is this understanding that by the end the climate crisis is also a social crisis, right? This is what you in particular put forward, and this you can also very well see also when we look to this vulnerable points in or the climate heating points also in Santiago, where you will find very quickly that the heating points, the urban heating points, are in those areas where, for example, Renka, you were also presenting. And I think there's something which might be very interesting here to point out, that, by the way, it is about so that climate policies needs also to make a demand for increased economic justice and social equity in terms of this terms are pretty much interrelated, and I think this was very clear presented in your presentation. And one point which I also find very interesting is the methods that you are working with, and this is also an entering point to our next presentation by the CEPAL, where you were also mentioning the aspects of the living labs, right, which are this kind of co-production where you are not only putting, let's say, the vulnerable parts of the society and the state together. You are also thinking, for example, on the energy producers and on the users. And also, on the other hand, you are also thinking on a very important aspect, which I would say is a cross issue also in Latin America, because the state, as we know, or maybe we don't want to know that, or we don't like it to hear that, but usually it's not taking this kind of role as we are used in for example, in Europe, that they are leading lots of those programs. When we look to the governance, for example, of climate crisis implementations programs in Germany, then you will find a governance which is very even when it comes, for example, from the program then to how to incorporate the local communities. And therefore, this aspect that you are mentioning, to incorporate different, let's say, also private companies and also the private, let's say, sector is, I would say, very interesting. And therefore, I would really like to hand over to the next presentation. And I would like to understand, because as I read well, and I know, Sepal, you are working since a long time already in Latin America, and always about this understanding, how do research policy interface can looks like, for example. And this is a lot of field work that you are doing by combining, for example, different urban regions together, but also to understand what kind of methods can be introduced to this kind of exchange and to produce this co-production. So I would like to raise over to our next presentation, and please could you first of all present yourself and then start with the presentation. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Marina Gosselin, and I work in the settlements unit, which is within the sustainable development.
I think we need a there's a microphone problem, possibly. Maybe we can wait for...
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yes? Oh, okay, perfect. Good. Sorry, I'll start again. So my name is Marina Gosselin. I work in the Human Settlements Unit, which is a unit within the Sustainable Development and Human Settlements Division of CEPAL, or ECLAC in English. Sorry, could we go 2 slides in? Next one, please. Thank you. So I just wanted to start off with putting emphasis on the role that cities will have in tackling issues such as climate change and social inequity. So basically, since we have over half the world's population living in cities at the moment, and as well the huge economic role that cities have, since they account for about 80% of the global GDP, we think that cities have the greatest potential to tackle these issues. But as well, it could be at smaller cities, not just capital or mega cities. Because small and intermediate cities have a significant percent of the global population, but they generally don't have the same amount of resources for planning and for investing in infrastructure projects and climate or inequity solutions. So in terms of tackling issues such as climate change and inequality, the region in general presents some challenges. It's highly heterogeneous, which makes it quite difficult to have a comparative study. So we see a lot of this in countries, particularly in the Caribbean region, which are small countries with small populations. They have slightly different governance structures, and they also use different land use and planning strategies. The region is also characterized with persistent poverty. There's a lot of growing inequalities. There's environmental degradation. And these are all problems that affect, or they're basically obstacles to achieving sustainable development. So we have a lot of potential in cities to tackle these issues, but sometimes we also have issues with governance. There's a lot of centralized governance structures here, so that means that local governments don't really have the power to implement local strategies. And strategies that could solve more local problems. So I'll just go to the next slide, please. So just briefly, in case you're not really familiar with what ECLAC does, so we're the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And basically we undertake studies, we do research, and we support activities with the member states, which is for Latin America and also the Caribbean, as I mentioned. And we basically promote economic and social development through regional cooperation and integration. And our division particularly, in our division particularly, our mission is to contribute to assessing advances in public policies, instruments, and institutions. And those are aimed at promoting a more inclusive economic activity with a lower environmental footprint in the region. So what I really wanted to talk about today was the programs and the activities that we do here at ECLAC, which address the issues that we've been discussing today, which is climate change and social inequity. So all of these programs we've got 4 programs that I'm going to discuss in the presentation today. And basically the idea with these is they either directly or sort of indirectly address both of these issues. So the first one we have is the EURI Climate program. So this is a regional cooperation program between the European Union and Latin America. And this focuses on public policies that address climate change. So this program aims to support implementation from the commitments of the Paris Agreement in the area of climate governance. So it provides funding, technical assistance for projects in the Latin American region. So they tend to focus more on topics such as forests, energy efficiency, water management, disaster risk reduction, urban mobility, resilient food production. So it's a bit less of a direct social inequality, but it does touch on that in an indirect way. So in ECLAC's role in this program is to basically support and contribute the design and implementation of public policies that are related to climate change in the whole region, and as well to fulfill national NDC targets. So the next program I want to discuss is the ESCASU agreement. So this is quite an important one for our division, since it's the first treaty in the world that has binding provisions on environmental human rights defenders. And it's also the first treaty concluded under ECLAC. So this agreement basically aims to guarantee the full and effective implementation of the rights of access to environmental information. It deals a lot with transparency on environmental information, as well as public participation in environmental decision making, access to justice in environmental matters, and as well it works on creating and strengthening capacities and cooperation in the region to protect the rights of present and future generations, so that they can live in a healthy environment and have a sustainable region. And the next one. So this is the regional action plan for the implementation of the New Urban Agenda. So we call this the RAP for short. So the idea with this is it's a document. It's basically a strategic framework or a guide, a transversal regional reference, if you will, that can be used in Latin America and the Caribbean. And basically it aims to help countries implement the New Urban Agenda. So the objective of the RAP is to outline the fundamental elements necessary to bring about the structural changes that are required to achieve sustainable development. So there are 6 action areas. So we've got national urban policies, urban legal frameworks, urban and territorial planning and design, urban economy and municipal finances, local implementation, monitoring, reporting, and revision mechanisms. So this document was prepared based on an analysis of several key documents from the UN, UN Habitat, such as the New Urban Agenda, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the Paris Agreement. So basically, this document places regional progress towards greater equality. And so basically, the idea is to promote inclusion in cities and in the territorial development process. And the final thing I want to discuss is the Urban and Cities Platform. This is something we're actually working on at the moment, and it's in development. So basically, this project arises from a response to collect and analyze information related to urban areas in the Latin America and Caribbean region. So the platform is basically going to serve like an objective tool. It will enable users to follow up on the implementation of the urban dimension of the 2030 Agenda, the New Urban Agenda, and then as well the Regional Action Plan, which I just mentioned. The idea is the platform will create a flexible and participatory space to monitor the development of cities, to strengthen local capacities, and we're going to facilitate the exchange of regional experiences towards sustainable development in the region, so that there's an open dialogue and people can, and experts, governments can learn from their experiences. So, sorry, the next slide. Yeah, so this is kind of the layout of the platform. So we're going to have a observatory and a virtual forum. So in the e-forum will be basically a space for analyzing and discussing urban and territorial dynamics and processes. And the e-forum, or the virtual forum, will house a virtual learning center, which will have courses, seminars, and conferences. While the observatory will be the place where we compile and visualize the urban and city level information, as well as indicators to monitor the implementation of the New Urban Agenda and the SDGs. It'll also include best practices related to legislation, public policies, and programs. And this will be from the national level to the local level. So the observatory essentially will provide relevant information and resources to support the development of qualitative and quantitative urban assessment methodologies. I think that's my last slide. Yep, I think that's all I've got. Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the last presentation. I think that there we can understand what kind of active and vivid exchange is going on actually in the region. I would like, seeing our time, that we are running out of time a little bit, I would like to pass over to the questions that we have here on the forum, so that I would like to ask you to give if you can respond them, or if there are particular questions also to you raised, that you please answer them so that we can go on with this discussion. And I think this is very challenging actually to understand how all the questions can be solved. And I would like to start with the first one, who is coming here from the N-AERUS network, because this is also maybe something which I should very quickly say, that we will have questions, or we encouraged also the different networks from the different regions to raise questions, so that you will see maybe questions which are also coming from other regions and are complaining or are even confirming some issues that we have talked about. And the first one is coming from N-AERUS itself, and it's asking on how do these challenges of heterogeneity and governance for implementing climate and social policies look like in other global regions? So would be the first question here. And do we have also other concrete local examples? I mean, we heard already from those ones which Cities Alliance was presenting on their work, which is mainly based on Africa, and we understood also what is going on in Latin America about those issues, which I would say there are similarities, because as we understand, there's always this kind of search also for a local solutions, and how do you combine this kind of exchange also with different parts of the society. So I'm looking also to other questions here. Here, for example, is also another question from Peter Gott, from one of also our researchers from N-AERUS, is asking, how do the speakers see the challenges in the various regions worldwide, similarities and differences? So maybe that might be also interested to have an answer to that. So it would be, so Josefa will copy those questions actually, so that you can all see them. And we would like to encourage you to be able to respond to them, or who wants to make here a response to those questions.
So let me just start. I think on the similarities. I mean, since we're discussing the role of cities in climate change for the last 15 years, but in the last 10 years there had been a number of approaches. Whereas urbanization is up and running, and the major bulk of urban growth is about to happen in Africa in the next 10 years. This process has been more or less closed in Latin America. Whereas, you see urbanization processes already still ongoing in Southeast Asia. The most of the lock-in effects in Latin America have been done. And so we always talked about on the housing, for example, it's very hard to retrofit. And this applies also to the use of ecosystems. I mean, what I would argue is the similarities that we have in the African region is that there are still resources and ecosystems to preserve. There are still cities to be built. There are still small and medium-sized cities to grow and double in size in the next 5 years. So you have that window of opportunity. And this is something different, I think, to Latin America. But I mean, we have many colleagues here that could discuss this in detail. But what we know from Latin America is, and South America, is that the cost for retrofitting is higher than an actual proactive steering of urbanization processes. And I think this has been reflected in many sectors. So I would argue, of course, every city is different, but the similarities when it comes to the challenges of growth, and particularly in Africa, is actually to be seen as an opportunity. So that there are the similarities that we can do. The second similarity and differences that we haven't talked about, we've touched upon a very an energy issue, then also on the kind of governance, not so much about financing. access to finance, in particular for small and medium-sized cities in every country, I would say, across the globe, is the same difficulty. And there is a structural reasons why does, in particular, financing for infrastructure, but also the climate financing, the access to those. This is an issue that most of the countries is not dealt with and needs to be dealt with at the national level most entirely. So which countries we have national enabling environments, national policies that thinks about, you know, those cities and lagging regions and small and medium-sized cities, and those cities we have now in Europe, the discussion because of the elections, you know, what do we do with those regions that I think are lagging behind, and so these are the questions I think that are similar in many regions, how to deal with it. And I think by differentiating differently, the commonality is the national level needs to take it on, and an agenda around small and medium-sized or lagging region, I think needs to be also addressed at the global level. I think this is my 50 cent on similarities and differences.
Yeah, thank you very much, René. I would like to give this question also to the Latin American parts here, the speakers, so that maybe if they have seen also your presentation coming from the African region, what would be some kind of new approach or interesting points that they could also somehow put into their work. This is also here one question which is raised from this part.
Yes, I think this question, we are not very close to the African reality, and I believe that it's a very different reality. And access, energy access, basic access is very strong a strong issue in Africa, whereas here we speak more about quality, about all types of quality issues around and clean energy issues. And in that sense, I believe that we're definitely in Latin America, we face a little bit of different issues, but at the same time, at the end, it's all about providing good basic installations, good basic housing, good basic water and energy installations, and also about maintenance. And I believe that that's an issue that has not been sufficiently on the table, the question of maintenance. The governments are very good at investing into capital, into new infrastructure, but in the medium term, this probably well-intended good infrastructure is not maintained well. We had very many projects in the solar energy area, thermal installations and PV installations that after 2 or 3 years are not being used because there's a lack of maintenance services also at the local level. That's why we insist so much on the fact that we have to deal with this in an integral way, looking at the family's needs, but also at the local development and taking these issues as local development issues. I believe that is very important. And I believe that territories are very different, and we have to take that into consideration, and they have to be dealt with from the territory and not from the central level. Chile is a very centralized country, and that's why we have to deal with many of the problems we have at the moment. So the perspective from the territories and the governance at the local level is extremely important and has to be strengthened very much. And all of these solutions.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicola. I'm seeing here my colleagues writing that we should come to an end, and I would like to, or let's say everybody here, Josefa, Colin, me, a lot of people always here cross-posting and writing and supporting the entire webinar. We would like really to thank you. This is our first webinar that we did in this series. And so we had some kind of challenges, and we hope we had a very interesting discussion. I mean, we learned a lot, and there will be also a survey that we will send to you, because for us as researchers, it might be also very interesting to understand how do you see this kind of research policy interface very clear in terms of what could be the demands that you as being in the field and working on these issues might be interesting for you to raise here, and that we should also further do research on in this kind of interface. This would be very interesting for us. So we would like really to thank you again for your presentations, for trusting in us and to making this kind of webinar with us, and also to invite you already to that. As I said, it's a series, and we will keep on doing these webinars in every month. We hope so, and we will in any case present you the next topic and see what could be topics that you would like to interrelate with or give statements and so forth. So I'm also here looking to my so maybe you want to say something, Anthony, because from my side, I would like to thank everybody and pass the word quickly to Anthony so that we could then also close this session.
Yeah, thank you, Paola. Sorry, I just had to unmute myself. I mean, this dialogue is only a starting point. I would recommend to whoever wants to stay in touch, fill out the survey. So the dissemination of the upcoming webinars will be the same. We also will try to answer all the questions that were voiced based on the emails that we get, that we can share not only like the information and the presentation, but eventually also preliminary answers to the questions. If participants have further comments, etc., after the presentations have started.
I think we lost Anthony. And hello? So if we don't catch Anthony any longer, so I would like to thank everybody again. And there are also there are a lot of few questions which are also here in the panel, which are for the specific of one or two kind of presentations that have been done here. We would like also to send these ones to you, and please join us again, and we would like to stay in touch with you to further improve this kind of webinar series and to see what kind of very much interesting aspects we can discuss further on. Thank you very much. And now I go mute, but not without saying hello to Colin again, who facilitated us and helped us to put this kind of equipment and also the whole webinar together. Thank you very much, Colin. Bye. Thank you very much to all of you.